Allied leaders of World War I. War I, War I, War I. The Allied leaders of World War I were the political and military figures that fought for or supported the Allies during World War I. Russian Empire. Nicholas Roman II, last Tsar of Russia, titular King of Poland and Grand Duke of Finland. Georgy Lvov, Prime Minister of the Russian Provisional Government 1917. Alexander Kerensky, Minister of War 1917. Prime Minister of the Russian Provisional Government 1917. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, Commander-in-Chief and Viceroy in the Caucasus. Ivan Gormykhin, Prime Minister of Russia 1914-1916. Boris Sturmer, Prime Minister of Russia 1916. Alexander Trepov, Prime Minister of Russia 1916-1917. Nikolai Golitsyn, Prime Minister of Russia 1917. Vladimir Sukhomlinov, Minister of War 1909-1915. Alexei Polivanov, Minister of War 1915-1916. Dmitry Shuvayev, Minister of War 1916-1917. Mikhail Belyaev, Minister of War 1917. Chief of Staff 1914-1916. Alexander Guchkov, Minister of War 1917. Ivan Grigorovich, Minister of Navy 1911-1917. Nikolai Yanushkevich, Chief of Staff 1914. Pyotr Avryanov, Chief of Staff 1916-1917. Ivan Romanovsky, Chief of Staff 1917. Vladimir Marashevsky, Chief of Staff 1917. Mikhail Alexeyev, Commander of Southwestern Front 1914, Northwestern Front 1915, Chief of Staff 1915-1917, Commander-in-Chief of the Army 1917, Yakov Zhilinsky, Commander of the Northwestern Front in the early stages of the war 1914, Alexander Samsonov, Commander of the Second Army for the invasion of East Prussia, Paul von Rennenkampf, Commander of the First Army for the invasion of East Prussia, Nikolai Ivanov, Commander of the Russian Army on the Southwestern Front 1914-1916 and responsible for much of the action in Galicia, Alexei Brusilov, Commander of the Southwestern Front 1916-1917, then Provisional Commander-in-Chief after the Tsar's abdication, Lavr Kornilov, Commander of the Southwestern Front and Commander-in-Chief August 1917. Vladislav Klembovsky, Commander of the Northern Front 1917, followed by becoming Commander-in-Chief in August 1917. Nikolai Rusky commanded the Third Army, Northwestern Front 1914-1915, and lastly the Northern Front 1915. Alexei Kuropatkin, Commander of the Northern Front 1916. Paul von Plewey, Commander of the Fifth Army, 12th Army, and briefly the Northern Front 1916. Alexei Ever took part in the invasion of Galicia as commander of the 10th Army, later commanded the Western Front 1915-1917. Anton Denikin led the 8th Army in the Brusilov offensive and commanded the Western Front in 1917. Ilarion Ivanovich Vorontsov Dashkov, Governor-General of the Caucasus Viceroyalty and Commander of the Caucasus Army 1914-1915, Nikolai Yudenich, Commander of the Russian Forces in the Caucasus Campaign 1917, Andrei Zayanchkovsky, Commander of the Russian-Romanian Dobruja Army in the Romanian Campaign, Vladimir Viktorovich Sakharov, commanded the 11th Army 1915-1916, the Danube Army 1916, and became Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Romanian Front 1916-1917. Dmitry S.H. Cherbachev commanded the 11th Army and later became Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Romanian Front in 1917. Mikhail Dietrichs, commander of the Russian Expeditionary Force at the Macedonian Front. Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, Chief of the Imperial Russian Air Service. Andrei Eberhardt, Commander of Black Sea Fleet 1914-16. Alexander Kolchak, Commander of Black Sea Fleet 1916-17. Nikolai Essen, Commander of Baltic Fleet 1913-1915. French Third Republic. Raymond Poincaré, President of France 1913-1920. René Viviani, Prime Minister of France 1914–1915. Aristide Briand, Prime Minister of France 1915–1917. Paul Painlevé, Prime Minister of France 1917. Georges Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France and Minister of War 1917–1920. Adolphe Messimy, Minister of War 1914. Alexander Millerand, Minister of War 1914–1915. Marie-Jean Lucien Lacaze, Minister of War 1917. Paul Painlevé, Minister of War 1917. Joseph Joffre, Commander-in-Chief of the French Army 1914–1916. Marshal of France from the end of 1916. Ferdinand Foch, Commander of French Army Group North 1914–1916. Commander-in-Chief and Generalissimo of the Allied Armies 1918. Marshal of France from August 1918. Robert Nivelle, Commander-in-Chief of the French Army 1916–1917. Philippe Pétain, Commander-in-Chief of the French Army 1917–1918. Marshal of France from November 1918. Maxime Weygand, General in the French Army and one of the permanent military representatives in the Allied Supreme War Council. Augustine Dubail commanded the First Army 1914–1915, followed by Army Group East at Battle of Verdun until 1916. He was later military governor of Paris 1916–1918. Fernand de Langle de Carry, commander of the Fourth Army in the Battle of the Ardennes 1914. Later took command of Central Army Group in 1915–1916. Victor Durbel, commander of all French troops in Belgium in 1914, then the 8th Army 1915–1916 and 10th Army, which participated in the Second and Third Battle of Artois. Maurice Sarrail, commander of the Army of the Orient and which evolved to the Allied Army of the Orient on the Macedonian Front 1915–1917. Adolphe Guillaumet, commander of the Allied Army of the Orient 1917–1918. Then became military governor of Paris and was appointed to the Supreme War Council. Louis Franchet d'Espery, commander of Army Group North 1916–1918, the Allied Army of the Orient and in the liberation of Serbia 1918. Joseph Gallieni, military governor of Paris and Minister of War 1915–1916. Mitchell Joseph Monery, commander of the Sixth Army 1914–1915 during the First Battle of the Marne. Pierre Rox commanded the First Army 1915–1916 and served as Minister of War 1916. Marie-Eugène Devaney, General of the First Army 1917–1918 and Chief of Staff to Philippe Pétain. Paul Meister, commander of the Sixth Army 1917. The 10th Army as part of the Italian Expeditionary Force in the Italian Front 1917–1918. Finally, the Northern Army Group 1918. Henry Putz, commander of the Army Detachment of the Vosges, which later became the 7th Army 1914–1915. Louis de Monthy, commander of the 10th Army 1914–1915, followed by command of the 7th Army in 1915. Notably at the Battle of Hartmannswillerkopf. Georges Louis Humbert, commander of the 8th Army 1915, followed by command of the 3rd Army 1915–1918. Denis Auguste Duchesne, commander of the 6th Army 1917–1918 during the Third Battle of the Aisne. Charles Mangan commanded the 6th Army 1916–1917 in the Second Battle of the Aisne and later the 10th Army in the Second Battle of the Marne. Henry Giraud led the Oriental Expeditionary Forces in 1915 during the Gallipoli Campaign, where he lost his arm. Later commanded the Fourth Army 1915–1916 and 1917–1918. Francois Anthony, commander of the First Army during the Battle of Passchendaele 1917. Henry Mathy is Berthelot, general of French military mission in Romania and the Fifth Army. Noel Edouard de Castelnau, commander of the 2nd 1914–1915, Central Army Group 1915 and Eastern Army Group 1918. Émile Fayolle, commander of the 1st Army 1916–1917, Army Group Center 1917, French divisions to the Italian Front 1917-1918, and the Army Group Reserve 1918. Hubert Lyautey, Resident General of Morocco 1912-1916, suppressing rebellions in North Africa during the war. Minister of War 1916-1917. Jean Cesare Graziani, commander of the Italian 12th Army in the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. Milan Rastislav Stefanik, commander of Czechoslovak legions. Edouard Baers, commander of French Air Force. British Empire. King George V, King of the United Kingdom and the dominions beyond the sea, Emperor of India. United Kingdom. H. Asquith, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom 1908-1916, Secretary of State for War 1914. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom 1916-1922, Secretary of State for War 1916. Herbert Kitchener, Secretary of State for War 1914-1916. Edward Stanley, Secretary of State for War 1916-1918. The Viscount Milner, Secretary of State for War 1918-1919. James Wolfe Murray, Chief of the Imperial General Staff 1914-1915. British troops in Egypt 1916-1917. William Robertson, Chief of the Imperial General Staff 1916-1918. John French, Commander-in-Chief of the BF 1914-1915 and Commander-in-Chief, Home Forces 1915-1918. Douglas Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force 1915-1918. Henry Wilson, Advisor of John French and Chief of the Imperial General Staff 1918-1922. Archibald Murray, Chief of Staff of the British Expeditionary Force 1914-1915, Chief of the Imperial General Staff 1915 and Commander of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force 1916-1917. Edmund Allenby, Commander of the Third Army and later the Egyptian Expeditionary Force 1917-1918. Henry Horne, Commander of the First Army 1916-1918. Horace Smith Dorrien led the Roman II Corps of the BF at the Battle of Mons and Le Cateau. He then commanded the Second Army 1914-1915. Herbert Plumer, commander of the V Corps, at the Second Battle of Ypres 1915, followed by command of the Second Army 1915-1917. He then led the Italian Expeditionary Force before going back to the Second Army 1918. Henry Rawlinson, British General of the Fourth Army, notably at the Battle of the Somme and Battle of Amiens. Hubert Gough, Commander of the Fifth Army 1916-1918. George Milne, Commander of the British Salonika Army at the Salonika Front 1916-1918. The Earl of Cavan, Commander of the Italian 10th Army at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. Ian Hamilton, Commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force during the Gallipoli Campaign. Reginald Wingate, Commander of the British forces in the Anglo-Egyptian Darfur Expedition. Charles Macpherson Doble, Commander of the Allied force in the Cameroon Campaign. Hastings Ismay, Commander of the British forces in the Somaliland Campaign. Stanley Maude, Commander during the Mesopotamian Campaign. Prince Louis of Battenberg, 1st Sea Lord 1912-1914. Lord Fisher, 1st Sea Lord 1914-1915. Sir Henry Jackson, 1st Sea Lord 1915-1916. Sir John Jellicoe, Commanding Officer of the Grand Fleet 1914-1916, 1st Sea Lord 1916-1918. Sir Roslin Wemyss, 1st Sea Lord 1918-1919. David Beatty, Commanding Officer of the Grand Fleet 1916-1919. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty 1911-1915. Arthur Balfour, First Lord of the Admiralty 1915-1916, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs 1916-1919. Sir Edward Carson, First Lord of the Admiralty 1916-1917. Sir Eric Geddes, First Lord of the Admiralty 1917-1919. John de Roebuck, Naval Commander in the Gallipoli Campaign. David Henderson, Director General of Military Aeronautics 1913–1917. Sir Edward Grey Beatty, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs 1905–1916. Australia. Joseph Cook, Prime Minister of Australia 1913–1914. Andrew Fisher, Prime Minister of Australia 1914–1915. Billy Hughes, Prime Minister of Australia 1915–1923. Ronald Munro Ferguson, Governor-General of Australia. Edward Mullen, Minister for Defence, to 17 September 1914. George Pearce, Minister for Defence from 17 September 1914. Jens Jensen, Minister for the Navy 1915–1917. Joseph Cook, Minister for the Navy 1917–1920. William Birdwood, Commander of the Anzac 1914–1916 and Australian Imperial Force 1915–1919. John Monash, Commander of the Australian Corps 1918. William Holmes, Commander of the Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force 1914–1915. Harry Chauvel, Commander of Desert Mounted Corps 1917–1919. Canada. Robert Borden, Prime Minister of Canada 1911–1920. The Duke of Connaught and Strathearn, Governor-General of Canada 1911–1916. The Duke of Devonshire, Governor-General of Canada 1916–1921. Sam Hughes, Minister of Militia and Defence 1911–1916. Albert Edward Kemp, Minister of Militia and Defence 1916–1917. Minister of Overseas Military Forces of Canada 1917–1918. Joseph Flavel, Chairman of Imperial Munitions Board 1915–1919. Edwin Alderson, Commander of the Canadian Corps 1915–1916. Julian Byng, Commander of the Canadian Corps 1916–1917 and British Third Army 1917–1919. Arthur Currie, Commander of 1st Canadian Division 1915–1917 and Canadian Corps 1917–1919. British India. Lord Hardinge, Viceroy of India 1910–1916. Lord Chelmsford, Viceroy of India 1916–1921. Robert Crewe Milnes, Secretary of State for India 1911–1915. Alston Chamberlain, Secretary of State for India 1915–1917. Edwin Samuel Montagu, Secretary of State for India 1917–1922. Beauchamp Duff, Commander-in-Chief, India 1914–1916. Charles Monro, Commander-in-Chief, India 1916–1920. Mediterranean Expeditionary Force 1915–1916 and the British First Army 1916. John Nixon, Commander in the British Indian Army in Army. James Wilcox, Commander of the Indian Corps on the Western Front. Union of South Africa. Louis Botha, Prime Minister of South Africa. The Earl of Buxton, Governor-General of South Africa. Jan Smuts, Commander in the South West Africa Campaign and in the East African Campaign 1916–1917. Jacob van Deventer commanded the Union Defence Force and later all forces of the South African Overseas Expeditionary Force in the East African Campaign 1917–1918. Dominion of New Zealand. William Mathy, Prime Minister of New Zealand. The Earl of Liverpool, Governor-General of New Zealand. Alexander Godley, Chief of Army of New Zealand Military Forces 1910–1914 and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force 1914–1918. Alfred William Robin, Quartermaster General and Chief of Army of New Zealand Military Forces 1914–1919. Andrew Hamilton Russell, Commander of the New Zealand Division. Dominion of Newfoundland. Edward Morris, Prime Minister of Newfoundland 1909–1917. John Crosbie, Prime Minister of Newfoundland 1917–1918. William Lloyd, Prime Minister of Newfoundland 1918–1919. Walter Edward Davidson, Governor of Newfoundland 1913–1917. Charles Alexander Harris, Governor of Newfoundland 1917–1922. Arthur Lovell Haddo, Commander of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment in the Battle of the Somme 1916. James Forbes Robertson, Deputy Commanding Officer of the 1st Battalion of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, acting commander during the Battle of Monchy-le-Preux, part of the Battle of Arras. Kingdom of Serbia. Peter I, King of Serbia. Crown Prince Alexander, Regent, nominal Commander-in-Chief. Nikola Pasic, Prime Minister 1912–1918. Radivoj Bajovic, Minister of War 1914–1915. Radimir Putnik, Chief of Staff of the Serbian Army 1914–1915. Sivijin Misite, Deputy Chief of General Staff 1914. Commander of 1st Army 1914–1915, 1917, and Chief of General Staff 1918. Petr Bajovic, Commander of 1st Army 1914, Deputy Chief of General Staff 1915–1916, Chief of General Staff 1916–1918, later Commander of 1st Army 1918. Stepa Stepanovic, Commander of 2nd Army 1914–1918. Pavel Jurizic Sturm, Commander of 3rd Army 1914–1916. Kingdom of Montenegro. Nikola I, King of Montenegro, Montenegro. Janko Vukotic, Prime Minister and Commander of the 1st Army. Fazidar Jankovic, Chief of Staff of the Montenegrin Supreme Command. Petr Pezic, Chief of Staff of the Montenegrin Supreme Command. Andrija Radovic, Prime Minister in exile 1916–1917. Kr Stopapovic, General during the Montenegrin Campaign. Belgium. Albert I of Belgium, King of the Belgians and Commander-in-Chief. Charles de Broqueville, Prime Minister 1911–1918. Gerard Coreman, Prime Minister 1918. Antonin de Selliers de Morinville, Chief of Staff until September 6, 1914. Felix Wielemans, Deputy Chief of Staff 1914 and Chief of Staff 1914–1917. Louis Roucoy, Chief of Staff 1917–1918. Cyriac Villain, Chief of Staff 1918. Émile Dawson de St. Georges, Commander of the 2nd Division in the German invasion of Belgium, later military envoy of the Belgian government in exile. Alphonse Jacques de Dixmude, General notable for his role in the Battle of the Usser, later commanded the 3rd Division 1917–1919. Gerard Lemon, General commanding the defense of Liège. Charles Timur, Commander of the Colonial Force Publique in the East African Theatre. Luxembourg. Marie Adelaide, Grand Duchess of Luxembourg. Paul Eystein, Prime Minister. Kingdom of Italy. Victor Emmanuel Roman III, King of Italy. Antonio Salandra, Prime Minister of Italy 1914–1916. Paolo Boselli, Prime Minister of Italy 1916–1917. Vittorio Orlando, Prime Minister of Italy 1917–1919. Vittorio Italico Zupelli, Italian Minister of War 1914–1916–1918. Paolo Moro, Italian Minister of War 1916–1917. Gaetano Giardino, Italian Minister of War 1917. Vittorio Luigi Alfieri, Italian Minister of War 1917–1918. Luigi Cadorna, Chief of Staff of the Italian Army 1914–1917. Armando Dias, Chief of Staff of the Italian Army 1917–1919. Emmanuel Filiberto, Commander of the 3rd Army through all 12 battles of the Isonzo. Guglielmo Pecori Giraldi, Commander of the 1st Army 1916–1918. Luigi Capello, Commander of several Army Corps, and later the 2nd Army in 1917. Gaetano Giardino, Commander of several Army Corps and close advisor to Armando Dias, stopped the Austrian offensive in the Second Battle of the Piave River as commander of the 4th Army 1918. Mario Nicolas di Robolint, commander of the 4th Army 1915–1918 and Italian representative to the Allied Supreme War Council. Pietro Frugoni, commander of the Second Army in the first four battles of the Isonzo 1915–1916, later commanded the newly created Fifth Army. Enrico Caviglia commanded the Roman 24 Army Corps in the 11th Battle of the Isonzo, and was later in command of the newly created 8th Army. Ernesto Mameli, Italian commander on the Macedonian front. Paolo Theondi Revel, commander-in-chief of the Italian Navy. Alfredo, acting chief of staff of the Italian Navy. Luigi Aimdio, commander-in-chief of the Adriatic Fleet of Italy. Maurizio Moris, head of Italian military aviation. Kingdom of Romania. Ferdinand I, King of Romania. Ion IC Brașeniu, Prime Minister of Romania 1914–1918. Alexandru Averescu, Prime Minister of Romania 1918 and commander of the Second Army, Third Army, then Army Group South. Vintila Brașeniu, Minister of War. Vasil Zatu, Chief of the General Staff of Romania 1914–1916. Constantin Prizan, commander of the Fourth, also known as Northern Army, later Chief of the General Staff of Romania 1916–1918. Ion Culcer led the First Army during the Battle of Transylvania. Iremia Grigorescu, commander of the Roman II Corps, VI Corps, and finally the First Army during the Battle of Maristi. Constantin Christescu, Chief of Staff of the Second and Third Army and later of Army Group Averescu, later commanded the Northern and First Army. Mihail Aslan, commander of the Third Army. Archer Vatoinu, commander of the Roman II Corps during the Battle of Maristi, later commander of the Second Army 1917–1918. Ion Dragolina, commander of the First Division at the Battle of Orsova, later briefly commander of the First Army 1916. Eustatio Sebastian, commander of the Romanian Navy 1909–1917. United States. Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. Thomas R. Marshall, Vice President of the United States. Newton D. Baker, Secretary of War. Josephus Daniels, Secretary of the Navy. Tasker H. Bliss, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army 1917–1918. Peyton C. March, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army 1918. John J. Pershing, Commander of the American Expeditionary Forces. William Sims, Commander of all American Naval Forces in Europe. Hunter Liggett, Commander of the I Corps 1917–1918 and the First American Army 1918. Robert Lee Ballard, Commander of the Second American Army 1918. Empire of Japan. Yoshihito, Emperor of Japan. Akuma Shinobu, Prime Minister of Japan 1914–1916. Karachi Masatake, Prime Minister of Japan 1916–1918. Haratakashi, Prime Minister of Japan 1918–1921. Kamio Mitsuomi, Commander of the Army during the Siege of Tsingtao. Kato Sadakichi, Commander of the Second Fleet during the Siege of Tsingtao. Kozo Sato, Commander of the Second Special Task Fleet in the Mediterranean. Kingdom of Greece. Constantine I, King of Greece 1913–1917. Alexander of Greece, King of Greece 1917–1920. Eleftherios Venizelos, Prime Minister of Greece. Panagiotis Danglis, Commander-in-Chief of Greek forces on the Macedonian front. Emmanuel Zimbrakakis commanded the first Greek units on the Macedonian front and commanded the Greek forces in the Battle of Skraddi Legend. Leonidas Paraskevopoulos, commander of the I Army Corps 1917–1918. Pavlos Kounturiotis, Minister of the Navy. Kingdom of Hejaz. Hassan bin Ali, King of Hejaz, Sharif of Mecca, and leader of the Arab Revolt. Faisal bin Hassan, commander of the Northern Arab Army. Abdullah bin Hassan, commander of the Eastern Arab Army. Ali bin Hassan, commander of the Southern Arab Army. T.E. Lawrence, British officer in the Arab Revolt. First Portuguese Republic. Bernardino Machado, President of Portugal. Afonso Costa, Prime Minister of Portugal. José Norton de Matos, Minister of War of Portugal. Fernando Tamagnini Dubail Silva, Commander-in-Chief of the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps 1917–1918. Tomás Antonio Garcia Rosado, Commander-in-Chief of the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps 1918. José Augusto Alves Ricadas, Commander of the Portuguese forces in the Southwest Africa Campaign. José César Ferreira Gil, Commander of the Portuguese forces in the East African Campaign. First Republic of Armenia. Alhans Kejaznyuni, Prime Minister of Armenia. Andronik Ozanian, Commander in the Caucasus Campaign, never recognized the First Republic of Armenia and fought independently. Aram Manoukian, Minister of Internal Affairs, All Affairs. Alexander Kotizhan, Foreign Minister. Alhans Hakverdian, Defense Minister. Tab Nazarbekian, General and Commander-in-Chief of the Armenian Army. Drastamet Kanayan, General in the Armenian Army. Mavsis Silikian, General in the Armenian Army. Kingdom of Siam. Rama Vi, King of Siam. Keofreya Bodin Dechanachit, Minister of Defense and Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Siamese Army. Chakrabongs Bhuvanath, Chief of Staff in the Royal Siamese Army. Freya Thefetsadin, Commander of Siamese Expeditionary Forces on the Western Front. Emirate of Nejd and Hassa. Abdul Aziz Ibn Saud, Emir of Nejd and Hassa. William Shakespeare, British military advisor to Emirate of Nejd and Hassa. First Brazilian Republic. Venceslau Braz, President of Brazil. Pedro Frontin, Admiral and Commander of the Brazilian Naval Division DNAG. José Pessoa Cavalcanti, Brazilian captain and part of the preparatory military mission of Brazilian officers to French units in 1918. Dr. Nabucco Gouveia, Chief of the Brazilian Medical Delegation. Republic of China. Yuan Shikai, Lai Yuan Hong, 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 Feng Yuezhang,